Rabies and Germs, welcome to Taking a Stab. My name is McConnaughay, and you're watching this on the NJ Today YouTube channel. For those that aren't aware, I have been revisiting and reflecting on the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, a series I feel I have always had a great connection to. Although I recognize the series has a lot of problems, that doesn't stop me from loving it anyway, but it shows I can be objective about it, at least on some level. In a previous video, I summarized my thoughts on A Nightmare on Elm Street all the way up till Elm Street 3, and in this video, I'll take a look at 4, 5, and 6 with my opinion on Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Freddy vs. Jason, and the remake set to arrive later on. I wasn't very supportive of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3's approach, even though I recognize that others have a lot of appreciation for it. In that regard though, at least even if 3 didn't come together in the ways I would have liked, at least it had a fair share of memorable moments and a spark of inspiration. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, carries from the previous film and begins to use Alice Johnson as a means to gain access to new victims. This film, unfortunately, is a film that oftentimes I forget exists altogether because of how underwhelming and lacking of note it is. Some of the dialogue in 4, in a lot of ways, reminds me of the cliche of when an older person tries to throw around hip, cool lingo or seem like they come from the wrong side of the tracks, which is only more jarring when you consider it's young people delivering these lines. Suffice to say, the dialogue and its execution is more off-putting than accomplishing of making me care about the characters involved. The only really appealing aspect about the 4th Elm Street at all, at least in my opinion, is the special effects implemented at the end, when all the souls Freddy has taken over the years are shown swimming around his burnt flesh. The aesthetic itself is sickening and gross, and the sight as they vacate his body is certainly memorable and one to behold. As I watch A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, I feel as though I am halfway convinced it is my favorite film of the series so far. I feel as though this will be an unpopular opinion, and I will start off by saying that when I was a kid, and for most of my teenage years, I would comfortably regard either Freddy vs. Jason, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, or A Nightmare on Elm Street as my favorite films in the series. It's important to note that I haven't yet gotten to sharing my thoughts on New Nightmare or Freddy vs. Jason yet, but something about Dream Child really showed how my childhood embraced the Freddy Krueger character. The film is about the main character Alice, who had been seen in the previous film. Her friends are being offed one by one, and since Freddy has been using her dreams as a passage to target her friends, she's confused because her friends are being killed when she is still awake. This soon helps her realize that Freddy is using her dreaming unborn child as a tool to help him. In retrospect, Dream Child leads to a lot of questions. I have no real clear explanation for how Freddy's abilities are defined, mostly because the series itself generally reworks them for convenience. The concept itself in this film is particularly muddied, with Alice's unborn child Jacob acting as a small child in the dream world, playing a vital part in stopping Freddy and being around for a cheesy one-liner of his own. When I shared my thoughts about A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 in the earlier installment, I said that Freddy had been defanged, and I mentioned the wizarding sequence as one of the lowest moments in the series. Dream Child, although definitely has moments comparable in ridiculousness, I think that it has more visual tone that better accommodates such scenes. If we're being completely honest, the first A Nightmare on Elm Street is the best told story of the series at this point, with the best story and the best acting all together. Elm Street 5's story intrigues, but it is much too cluttered to ever really work as a cohesive idea. At the same time though, unlike 3 or 4, it doesn't seem nearly as complicated, and appeals in a way that better embraces the approach they'd since decided to take. The acting is spotty at best as well, varying from actor to actor, but never really shining in any respect. If taken as how it appealed to me, Elm Street 5 can be seen as a highlight reel of exhilarating and entertaining special effects that, although for the most part appear very dated, feel very inspired visually and are certainly memorable. I like them a lot, especially because of the way they looked. From the get-go, while I watched this film, I found myself engaged by how Freddy tormented his victims, and although in some instances, such as with the comic book inspired scene, it went a little too over the top for my taste, I still feel as though I offer it a little bit of leeway because of how aesthetically pleasing it was, and for the most part, it felt like Freddy was the one having fun and not the victims, who actually played it straight. A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 Dream Child won't be ranked highest amongst the series so far, simply because it lacks the discipline and structure, but I would put it ahead of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and behind A Nightmare on Elm Street. As a memorable film with great ideas, decently made, even if it didn't bring the best out of its ideas. As I've said, I have seen every A Nightmare on Elm Street film on many occasions, but I went ahead and watched every film again in an effort to make for certain this edition of Taking a Stab articulates my thoughts on them as accurately as possible. I remembered A Nightmare on Elm Street 1, 3, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and Freddy vs. Jason as being the highlights of the series overall. As the credits roll on Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, I realize how much of my opinion has changed. I realize that I still believe the original film is the best of the series up to this moment, but I realize that I consider 3 as a weak link, and I thought that Dream Child offered up a very memorable highlight reel type experience to the series. Although I won't talk about New Nightmare or Freddy vs. Jason until the next video, I can say now that, interestingly, Freddy's Dead isn't as horrible as what I remembered. Generally speaking, Elm Street 3 represented the film that began the Freddy character transitioning into a comedy act, and because it wasn't fully realized, it felt clunkier and more abrupt in that film, and plain and simple, I didn't enjoy 3's overall narrative. As it progressed, however, it eased into its new approach, and my appreciation for it increased, as demonstrated most with the 5th film, which wasn't a story well told, but a film with a collection of very entertaining special effects and inspired scenes that acted as the adhesive to keep together an otherwise so-so film. Freddy's Dead doesn't make the same claim, but at the same time it does have a couple of scenes I enjoyed. I always made jokes at the series' expense when I talked about the "now you're playing with power" lines, and how ridiculously over the top it is. But at the same time, yeah, those moments were cheesy, but when I look back at the series with nostalgic lenses, those moments in particular are some of the first that jump out at me. They were fun and carefree, and although it isn't until 30 minutes into Freddy's Dead that it feels as though something engaging starts to happen, the scene with Freddy dropping needles in the boiler room and scratching his claws against a chalkboard as a method of torture to one of his victims still remains a worthy addition to the highlight reel. The film's concept has intriguing ideas. Basically, Springwood is absent all its teenagers, except for one, because Freddy went ahead and flat out killed them all. This character, referred to as John Doe, ends up leading more victims over to Springwood, along with a new storyline that ultimately leads to a reveal that John Doe was sent to bring Freddy's daughter back to him. In particular, it can be said that Freddy's Dead is the first film that had the protagonist attempt at trying to bring Freddy into the real world to fight against. Although I would say that the execution leaves a lot to be desired, it also attempts at providing backstory for Freddy's mythology, which some might argue takes away from his mystique. What I'd say that is, although this film doesn't do it well, by 6 films into a series, I think it's logical to consider expanding on certain things like that. The implementation of 3D glasses was an unneeded and jarring inclusion as well. I'd single it out as being in my top 3 worst moments of the series, the first being the wizard scene in 3, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 as a whole. I'd say that for all the ideas Freddy's Dead had, I don't think it's right to call it an uninspired cash-in or to say that there weren't cogs that were turning. But I definitely think it continues the long-standing tradition of the series not really having much discipline or clear calculation with pacing, structure, or execution. It may have moments where England is allowed to shine with his role, but it's also just a clear example of how the series never knew how to make the most of his talent. I'd say it's right above Elm Street 4 as the worst film in the series so far. These are my thoughts on A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, and my thoughts on Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again soon when I share my thoughts on the final 3 films in the series. This has been Taking a Stab. My name's McConaughey, and I'll see you next time.